Hey folks, Phil Gallagher here for a legacy video. Today we're going to talk theory. David W. donated for an Elves Primer, so that's what I'm going to do today. I'm probably going to spend 45 minutes to an hour just kind of talking about some Elves theory. I have some relatively detailed notes. Notably, I'm not an Elves dedicated pilot, so there are people out there who are going to know much more about Elves than I do. Newton Heng, for example, I believe his handle on both Magic Online and Twitter is Hello Newton. He's one of the people that I turn to when I have questions about elves, as well as Julian. All right, let's kind of hop into things. So first, I want to talk about the impact of about the last 2 years on elves, because while the core of elves hasn't really changed in a very long time, it's been this like glimpse natural order value oriented deck, built around interactions such as like heritage druid and two other elves, or wirewood symbiote and elvish visionary and all of that sort of stuff. Like that's been the same for a long time. The last few years have drastically impacted the way elves deck building happens and really kind of fractured the deck, where pilots are playing elves in two relatively different ways, despite the core of the deck being the same. This was true previously, in that there was a debate on whether or not natural order was actually good in the deck. So there were people who were playing chaos elves, that is, elves without order, and there were people who were still playing the natural orders, but now there's a little bit of a bigger split. More on that in a second. So there are a few cards that drastically impacted the the way Elves was built in the last couple of years. And Allosaurus Shepherd is one of those. Maybe I should zoom in a little bit more for this. Yeah, the sideboard is not important for right now, but like the size of these cards is a little bit more important for you. All right, so Allosaurus Shepherd. It itself can't be countered, and your green spells can't be countered. And for 6 mana, for the rest of the turn, each elf creature you control has base power and toughness 5/5 and is a dinosaur, in addition to its other types. Number one, dinosaurs, cool. Number two, that is a lot of text on a one-drop card. And it's amazing what Allosaurus Shepherd has done to this deck. Breaking it down, number one, this is uncounterable, which means that it's great versus blue decks. This is an uncounterable win condition, and this was a huge problem with Natural Order and Glimpse of Nature in the past. If you cast a Natural Order and you lose a creature, and your opponent then, like, up days, like, that feels so bad. Like, you're down 2 cards to their one, and they probably didn't invest much or very much mana in order to get that 2-for-1. So this is a win condition that can't be countered. So against a lot of your, assorted blue soup decks, from Delver to Snowco, this is a really big deal. Now, unlike most cards that are good against blue, this is also good against Chalice piles. So, having an Allosaurus Shepherd in your deck completely changes any matchup that involves Chalice of the Void. Because normally, against elves pre Allosaurus Shepherd. And apologies in advance if I accidentally call this Allosaurus Rider. It's really hard to not do that. Anyway, previously, if you were playing a Chalice deck, you could often mulligan and Chalice on one, and that got you a whole lot of free wins unless your opponent was playing Cavern of Souls. And Cavern of Souls is something that's always a little bit tricky to go and play in an Elves deck because Cavern of Souls doesn't cast cards like Once Upon a Time, Glimpse of Nature, and Natural Order. So it doesn't do everything that you need it to do. You could play Cavern of Souls to help beat up on like the Chalice decks and force your stuff through, but then your Delver opponent goes, haha, I get to wasteland yet another one of your lands. So like there are real costs and trade-offs associated with things. So why is this so good against Chalice of the Void? Like, okay, it itself can get through, but more importantly, once a Chalice of the Void is in play, if you cast a Green Sun for X equals 1, that lets the Allosaurus Shepherd slip into play, and then it unlocks all of the other cards in your hand without you needing to remove it. Looking at things slightly out of order here, notice that in both this sideboard, which is one of Julian's lists from recently, and in this sideboard, which is an Elvish Reclaimer based build, there's no Rec Sage here. While Reclamation Sage in the past was something that was like really good to the point where it could be main decked in many cases because it was just that strong, you needed it to answer things like Chalice of the Void. Now that you have Allosaurus Shepherd as a green sunnable target, which answers Chalice of the Void, you free up a sideboard slot and you have a lot more flexibility, as well as something that looks much better in game one scenarios. I'm probably going to go through most of this water bottle while recording this video. I have a lot to say. So, kind of summing up Allosaurus Shepherd's changes to the deck, it is a win condition and very necessary utility stapled together on a 1-mana card, which already neatly fits into the deck, because wouldn't you know it, this is an elf. So it still works with all the Heritage Druid, Wirewood Symbiote sort of shenanigans that are already in the deck. And this is a huge shot in the arm for elves. The best comparison to this is Allosaurus Shepherd did for elves what Destiny Spinner did for Enchantress. It gives you a lot more reach. It's a win condition that doesn't cost you a lot, and it also just fits into the rest of the shell very well. What intrigues me the most about Allosaurus Shepherd is that it's incredible either as a 4 of or as a 1 of. We're going to talk about build differences in a little bit, but in a traditional Elves deck list, Allosaurus Shepherd is often played in multiples. But in a Reclaimer Elves deck list, it's usually just a 1 of tutor target. And there are differences in what that does to your deck, but it's very surprising that a new addition to the deck can be played as a 4 of or 1 of, and it's still extremely good in either case. Next up, let's talk about Once Upon a Time, everyone's favorite card to have in your opening hand. Now, that's probably not too. I'm partial to like Ancient Tomb myself, but you know, I get it. Once Upon a Time is often showing up as a 2 to 3 of in Elves deck lists these days. It's usually not a 4 of in these sorts of decks because there's diminishing returns on each copy. So the first copy is very, very good. It's in your opening hand, and you can use it to find the cards that you need. A lot of times what Once Upon a Time is doing in the deck is it's existing as another copy of Gaia's Cradle that doesn't cost you too much. So Elves decks in the past have often run crop rotation to have more functional copies of Gaia's Cradle, but that has the same problem against blue that I was just talking about, where if that card gets countered just like Natural Order, it's relatively devastating. You know, if you try to crop rotation for a Cradle against Delver, your opponent goes, "Up, oh, Spell Pierce." Like they're rubbing their hands greedily, like they just got everything that they could possibly want in the world. Like you're down a land, you're down a spell. Like that's all they're about in life. But it doesn't make a lot of sense to counter a Once Upon a Time in many cases because they don't know what you're looking for, right? Like they don't know if you want to land, they don't know if you want to spell, and a lot of times Once Upon a Time is helping you smooth out your draw, but if you kept your hand is functional most of the time, even if that card doesn't necessarily resolve. So 2 to 3 copies of this card is, I maybe don't want to say stock, but it's like right on the cusp of being stock in Elves. Not everyone is there. There are some reasons not to like Once Upon a Time. Very notably, it's not good on glimpse turns, especially when it's a tight glimpse turn, because this doesn't immediately cantrip. And the difference between you like drawing a 1-mana elf and casting it, and paying 2 for this and then drawing a 1 mana elf and casting this may be the deal breaker between you being able to continue to combo or not on any particular turn. So that's why people aren't maxing out on this, even though it can be quite good in this shell. Another thing that Once Upon a Time does is it allows you to finish a combo. And what I mean by that is sometimes you have, say, a Nettle Sentinel, but not a Birchler Ranger or a Heritage Druid to go with it. Or you have the Elvish Visionary, but not the Wirewood Symbiote to go with it. So in addition to just fishing for Gaia's Cradle, it can fish for the second half of the low impact combos that this deck can have. A lot of times when you talk about elves being a combo deck, you mean like the Glimpse and the Natural Order, but in reality, Elvish Visionary and Wirewood Symbiote wins just as many games, if not more games. The final thing that I want to talk about in terms of new cards is Archon of Valor's Reach. But in this one, not in this one, let's look at this list. I'm going to just read the text here. So it is a 6 mana 5/6 with Flying Vigilance Trample. As it enters the battlefield, choose artifact, enchantment, instant sorcery, or planeswalker. And players can't cast spells of the chosen type. So this is a card that's been out in a while, but recently it's been seeing a lot more play than it has in the past as far as availability. Sorry. It's been seeing a lot more play recently because of the functionality it has than it did in the past. That's a better way to say that. So what does this do? This is a very good card to get when you cannot cast a natural order for lethal. The primary game plan with natural order is always go and find the hoof and turn it sideways and kill your opponent. But that doesn't always happen. So there's a lot of times where on turn 2 or 3 you can cast a natural order, but you don't have the board presence to actually win the game. But Archon of Valor's Reach often effectively wins the games against a lot of decks. So consider that you are playing against Delver, and you flip that into play and you name Instant. You now have a 5/6 Vigilant Trample creature, which deals with Delver, which is just as good of a top clock as a Tarmogoyf, and you shut them off of their lightning bolts, so your stuff is going to be safe. They can't actually take this out of play, and you just turn it sideways about 3 times and they die. And those sorts of lines often end up being good enough. It's a similar but slightly different thing to what Progenitus is often doing in the post-sideboard games, where you can't kill them in 2 turns. Sorry, you can't kill them in 1 turn, but a Progenitus getting them over a couple of turns is usually good enough and often difficult to beat. Archon of Valor's Reach does just that, while also killing a lot of fringe or lesser played decks. So there are a lot of artifact-based decks built around things like, say, Echo of Eons or Metalcraft or Storm-based decks and other combo decks, where if you can quickly floop an Archon of Valor's Reach into play, you will just win the matchup. When your opponent shows up with like an Emery Echo deck and you put that into play on turn 3 naming Artifact, they go, oh, well that's not good. Similarly, when you put that into play versus a show and tell opponent, and you name sorcery, they have very limited options for how they can actually win the game. While doing that stuff, it also hoses fringe decks from time to time. Your opponent's playing some weird control deck with only planeswalkers as their win condition. Got him. Your opponent is playing Enchantress. Not anymore, they're not. So this has been a very powerful main deckable card. There are other cards that have been printed in the last couple of years that can slot into elves, but are not necessarily seeing a lot of play. So for example, there's a 2/2 card. It's a 2-drop. I think it has a wolf on its art, and when it enters play, when another creature enters play, you can pay X and put X number of counters on it. Some people have talked about putting that into elves, and indeed it did finish in a event in Japan recently, I think. But I haven't been overly impressed with that card seeing it in action. Okay, let's talk versions now. With any deck, there are always going to be flex slots, and how you choose to adjust those flex slots often dictates how your deck performs in a given weekend versus the metagame that you're expecting. But with elves right now, there's a couple of different versions that are very notably different from each other. And identifying those differences might be key to your success both in playing with the deck and playing against it. So this first list here by my good friend Julian is a pretty traditional elves deck list. And these days, what I mean when I say traditional elves is that it is playing Nettle Sentinel. So the versions that are running Nettle Sentinel are a touch closer to a combo deck than the ones that are playing Elvish Reclaimer. So what Nettle Sentinel allows you to do is glimpse and continue to go off very easily. The idea is you combine Nettle Sentinel with either Heritage Druid or Birchfloor Rangers. You cast a spell, you get to untap Nettle Sentinel, you use Nettle Sentinel and either Birchfloor Rangers or Heritage Druid to make mana, and you just continue glimpsing, and you get to untap those things. And so once you get going, it's often very hard to stop, and it snowballs completely out of control. What this version of the deck list can do is glimpse off both earlier and more consistently than the Elvish Reclaimer version. If we think, I gotta try to do this mirrored. All right. Okay. If we think about this as a spectrum, where over here there's combo, and over here there's control, and mid-rangey is something towards the middle, this one maybe like comes in over here, where it is like very much a combo deck, but it still has the capability of playing a mid-range game. Whereas the Elvish Reclaimer one is going to be a little bit closer to the middle, and it's going to have a better ability to play a mid-range game with more options. And it still has the combo elements, but it's going to be less consistent at, say, glimpsing off on turn 3 and actually getting the kill. So why might you not want to play this version? If the appeal is this deck is better at comboing than the other version, and Elves is a combo deck, you might go like, why don't I want to play this? And the answer is very simple. It's mostly one card, and that card is named Plague Engineer. If you look at what survives Plague Engineer in this deck when it's on Elves, it is a very short list. You get your Nettle Sentinel, who is a 2/2 elf, and you get Firewood Symbiote, which is a 1/1 insect. This is, of course, not counting Craterhoof. And it is very hard to get a kill once a Plague Engineer is in play. Like, you can create a 5/5 that is maybe a bit larger for one turn, but life's hard when Plague Engineer is in play. And the other version of this deck that we're going to look at is going to be much better at dealing with a Plague Engineer. Okay, so now we're going to look at a nice little Elvish Reclaimer version. This version has been championed by Newton Hang. You can watch me play a league with him where he does a lot of really cool next level plays if you're interested in a version that looks like this. And if you're interested in a version that looks more like Julian's one from what I was just talking about, I did a league with Daryl Ayers that you can take a look at there. Okay, so Elvish Reclaimer. This is going to turn into a 3/4, which is a really big deal because it's still threat sized and can still successfully attack into a Plague Engineer once a Plague Engineer is down. And it might sound funny to like focus so heavily on one card, but Plague Engineer has been a relatively highly played card in the last 6 months, a year. It shows up in a lot of decks, and being a single black card, it's a very easy thing to just slot into a sideboard and ruin someone's day with it. Now, with this version, it becomes much easier for you to have a realistic threat post Plague Engineer. Your opponent can Plague Engineer, kill 2 or 3 elves, and if you have 2 Elvish Reclaimers sitting in play, you go like, haha, attack you for 4, attack you for 4, attack you for 4. Your opponent's on the other side of the table going like, oh god, can I really block with this Plague Engineer to take one of those out? And if they do, your hand is unlocked again, and you just like continue to do your thing. And that's a huge strength of this build. So what are the other than like the obvious Plague Engineer stuff, what does the Elvish Reclaimer do to the deck? The Elvish Reclaimer gives you more access to Gaia's Cradle, which is already something that I was talking about with the Once Upon a Times. And Gaia's Cradle is a really good magic card. It just makes cats casting large, like natural orders, Crater Hoof, Green Suns, or like very large glimpse turns, just much, much easier. So you lose out some on your glimpse turns, get notably better versus Plague Engineer, and you get more options to like go and find Gaia's Cradle. And in some builds, it's not just Cradle. Many of the Reclaimer Elves versions only play Cradle as the things that they're looking at, but as you can see here with this deck list, this person has opted to put a Bojuka Bog into the main deck, as well as a Cavern of Souls in the main deck as other tutor targets. And the sideboard here has Caracas, as well as Cabal Pit, as other options that you can add to this utility toolbox. So, what's the downsides of this? The upsides sound great. More looks at Cradle, more utility. Like, what's not to like? This deck plays very differently from regular elves. And the decisions that you make are much less clear cut. And a lot of those decisions revolve around your sequencing involving Elvish Reclaimer and whether or not to activate it. When things are going well, it's often easy enough to tell what you're supposed to do, but when you start trying to play around things that could happen, it becomes a lot less clear cut. So let's start with an easy one. So, like, let's say you play an Elvish Reclaimer on turn 1, and you get the ability to untap with it, and you have a handful of 1-drops in your hand. Are you okay with taking your turn off to fetch up the Gaia's Cradle so that you can have a massive glimpse turn the following turn? Or are you supposed to play safer? Because what happens if you fetch that Cradle and then your opponent goes like Lightning Bolt your Reclaimer and it's dead? And now you're down another mana and you end up really far behind, and instead of gaining tempo with Gaia's Cradle, you end up losing it. This is a simple example, but there's a lot of scenarios roughly like that where whether or not to activate the Reclaimer has very real costs associated with it. Similarly, there's times where you have to be thinking about lines that allow you to grow your Reclaimer out of range of soft removal spells like Lightning Bolt before your opponent can answer it, and it mucks up your plans. So there is a very real learning curve with this deck. I used to own elves in paper, and when I played my league with Newton and I played a deck list like this one, I was exhausted after 5 matches with it because it was so mentally taxing for me to try to figure out everything with this deck as I was going along the first time that I played it. So if you have a lot of experience with an elves deck that looks more like this, and you transition to a Reclaimer Elves build, your first couple of leagues are probably not going to go well because they play out like a very, very different animal. And if you are going to play Reclaimer Elves, I really encourage you to look at someone else's content who has like made videos with Reclaimer Elves and watch a couple of matches just to see exactly what I mean in terms of the differences it provides to your deck. Okay, now, there's one other deck list that I wanted to show off because it shows off the sort of things that you can do with elves. And there's a lot to take in here. I also needed to get these green suns on the screen. Apologies. So this was a list from a Japanese event of some nature that had a couple of spicy things in it. So number one, it had Regal Force in the main deck. So when it ETBs, you draw a card for each green creature you control, and then it had 3 Okos in the sideboard. So turns out Oko is a good Magic card, and the ability to just go turn one mana elf into turn two Oko very, very consistently is a real game plan for a lot of matchups. So the overall shell that we saw in both of the other two decks is very much still here, but this deck kind of also has like a transformational sideboard, so to speak, where it can have a very different way of attacking in post sideboard games or matches that otherwise might be a little bit difficult. I know, I believe Julian has recorded some videos a while back with Oko Elves. So like this is definitely the sort of thing that you can do if you want to like be the mad lad and try something different. But whether or not something like this is going to be your best choice over a long term like stretch of time is like very much questionable. I don't like Regal Force in Elves anymore. I feel like that card has come and gone. Like we've gotten more powerful cards. What was this? Avacyn Restored? Yeah. So like this this card hasn't seen play in Legacy more or less in years, and there's probably a good reason for that. Like this doesn't have haste, it doesn't kill the turn that it comes down. Like drawing cards is cool and all, but you already have an Elvish Visionary Wirewood to do that. And we also have like much better green sun targets than we used to, so I don't feel like you always need to just fish through your deck. So I don't love this deck list or anything, but if you're looking to do something different, you can try something of this nature. Okay, so I want to transition into talking about the sideboard now, because even though there's all sorts of different elves deck lists, I feel like conceptually their sideboards tend to work the same way. So there's kind of 4 different categories of cards that go into elves sideboards, in my opinion. You have Graveyard Hate, Discard, Cards for Fair Matchups, and Tutor Targets. So again, Graveyard Hate, Discard, Fair Cards, Tutor Targets. Like you can play other things, but conceptually those are the categories that I group cards in when I'm thinking about sideboarding with and against elves. You usually play 3 to 4 pieces of Graveyard Hate. We can see this list has 3 Surgical Extractions, this list has 3 Leyline of the Voids, this list has 4 Leyline of the Voids. So like that tends to be a very stock piece of the Elves sideboard, mostly because of Black-Red Reanimator is like very much a thing that is prevalent on Magic Online, and I'm making this video on September 14th, 2020. At this exact time, Hogak is also really making waves online, and that's something that people need to be respecting right now. Well, next up, we have the discard, which is primarily there for combo hate. These days, most elves sideboards are starting with 4 Thoughtseize as the primary piece of interaction versus combo. So you can see this deck has 4 Thoughtseize, this one has 4 Thoughtseize and a 5th honorary copy in the form of Cabal Therapy, and this one has 4 Thoughtseizes and 2 Cabal Therapies. So the 4 Thoughtseizes are very much stock. Right now, that's not always true, but right now that seems to be pretty stock. And sometimes people will play other cards for combo decks other than just Thoughtseize if discard isn't good against the combo deck of the moment for some reason. And if that's the case, some of these discard slots tend to go down a little bit to be replaced by something else. Next up, there's 3 or 4 cards for fair matchups. And what I mean by that is any sort of mid-range deck, like blue or non-blue, you need some cards to help deal with the fair stuff. Because a lot of times you'll end up doing something like trimming a few cards that aren't particularly good in a matchup, but you want to have something that's not just Thoughtseize bring in. So looking at our role players here, in this first deck, we have kind of 6 cards. Well, I'm going to count this in a different category. We have 5 cards that fill that role. So we have Abrupt Decay that might be used to remove something like Delver or problematic cards like, say, Chalice of the Void, as well as Choke for the blue matchup. We take a look at this one. Slide this over here. As far as the stuff goes, we again see the Abrupt Decays. This Elvish Reclaimer deck is instead opting for a few more cards in the tutor category. Hold that thought for just a second. And then this version of the deck has opted to play Oko in those fair slots. So that that is their plan for addressing fair matchups, because Oko is relatively hard to beat. I don't know if you've noticed. You haven't? Well, you heard it here first. And the final category of things that I'm thinking about with an Elves sideboard is tutor targets. Usually this means silver bullets that can come in either off of Green Sun or Natural Order. The best example of this right now is unquestionably Collector Oof. That thing comes down and it absolutely hoses a lot of the decks that I play at the very least. Where it's very good against a lot of artifact-based decks, it's very good against some combo decks such as Ant or TES, and it just takes over a game. But there are other things that fall into this category. So, for example, Scavenging Ooze is simultaneously a card that can be good in fair matchups while also being a tutor target for Green Sun. And Progenitus is another one of these tutor targets that you usually floop into play via Natural Order. So note that this Elvish Reclaimer deck list, because they have access to land-based tutors as well, can throw things like Cabal Pit and Karakas in here. And so instead of opting for more cards for fair matchups, this deck has used those slots to instead have a slightly stronger toolbox package associated with it. And similarly, in this deck list, there's Reclamation Sage, Scavenging Ooze, and Collector Oof as the tutor targets. Notably, this was the only deck that opted to play Reclamation Sage because Allosaurus Shepherd does a lot of the lifting that card uses. But Rec Sage still does plenty of cool things, like destroying an Omniscience off of Show and Tell or something of that nature. Okay. The final category of things that I want to talk about here are play tips. So when you actually get down, you're sitting in a match, what sort of things should you about? All sorts of Elves Masters can do the technical things, well, if you're doing a glimpse turn and you have all 3 of these cards in hand, the sequencing order is A, then C, then B because of this reason. So instead, I'm going to stick a little bit closer to theory. When I'm playing Elves, I like to think about what my role is at any given time, because I think Elves is a deck that often pivots, sometimes multiple times within a single turn cycle, about what it is trying to accomplish in any given game. So, for example, you can have a game where your primary game plan is, I am going to put Archon of Valor's Reach into play and it beats my opponent. You can have a game where you need to combo off to race your opponent, and your game plan is, I need to glimpse off or natural order off as soon as possible, and I'm going to play towards that line. You can play a hand where you are attempting to go wide of your opponent. I'm going to make so many creatures that you can't block them all, and I'm just going to turn them sideways 3 times, and you will die. Whereas you can also go tall and say, I'm going to make 1 large Elvish Reclaimer quickly, and it's bigger than your creatures, and then I'm going to flop another one down to serve as my shield, and I'm just going to attack you for 3 every turn with this 1 creature that's bigger than your creatures. Nice Thalia, idiot. There's also going to be games where you are grinding your opponent out via Wirewood Symbiote and Elvish Visionary, and you're playing this slow game. So in this simple example here, I just did 5 very different types of games that you can play. And you might start out thinking, I am playing this sort of game, and then 1 draw step happens, and you go oh no, I need to be over here instead of over here. So be very conscious of your role in a matchup as well as your role in any given turn cycle, and be thinking about what lines you should be taking in order to play towards that. Okay, next up. This is a weird one. The line that always kills your opponent this turn is not always the best line. So I was recently playing a match with Daryl where we were on Elves, and he saw a lethal line and was like, hey, why don't we just cast Natural Order? And I'm like, yeah, I agree, we should cast Natural Order. He was like, yeah, we just get hoof and they die. And I was like, yeah, yeah, okay, we can try to kill them. And then they cast a Source of Plowshares on our Crater Hoof or something like that, and we fell just short of lethal, and I think we lost that game. And that was a very important lesson. Like, don't always go for lethal if there's things that are going to potentially beat you. And we could have just gotten Progenitus in that spot and ended up being much safer and killed our opponent over time instead of trying to kill them now. And I think that anecdote applies very well generally to how elves can be played. You can combo off, but if you think you can safely kill your opponent without comboing off just by turning creatures sideways over a couple of turns, and that's going to result in you winning more of the time, say because you don't have to sacrifice one of your important creatures to a natural order or something like that, then maybe that's the line that you should be taking instead of just trying to get your opponent dead. So don't always get tunnel visioned on like how quickly can I combo. Instead be asking yourself like, do I need to combo? Do I need to cast this spell? Is it better to just try to kill the opponent this turn? Or do I just get Progenitus and that beats my opponent, 90+% of the time very safely over 2 turns? So these are the sort of things that like I very much want to be thinking about when I'm playing elves. Like try to conceptualize your risk versus reward for lines and play appropriately. Like if you can take a turn that has an 80% chance of killing your opponent this turn, or you can take a line that has a 95% chance of killing your opponent over 2 turns. They just can't like combo you off and win in those 2 turns in any way. It might be better to just take the line that's safer, but takes a little longer. This is also very true of decks like lands, where like, yeah, I can make the Merit Lodge now, but I can still die to this thing. So let's not die to the thing, and let's just like squeeze the Vice Grips a little bit harder and kill you later. All right, next. Be very cognizant of Dryad Arbor when you are making end of turn fetching options. When I was playing with Newton, he was fetching Dryad Arbor about 50% more than I would have fetched Dryad Arbor. Having a Dryad Arbor around makes your cradles better. It makes your Quirion Rangers in particular like much, much better, and also gives you some other lines involving some of your other untapped as well. So I often play really scared with Dryad Arbor, and I'm always like, I don't want to fetch a Dryad Arbor because it could get bolted and then I'm down a land. But the upside of having a Dryad Arbor in play can be huge. Like the extra mana off of a Cradle or Quirion Ranger can be a really, really big deal. And there's also some other fringe stuff that it can do, such as like I'm going to block a creature with a Jitte with my Dryad Arbor and then bounce it with Quirion Ranger. So don't always visualize Dryad Arbor as natural order food. It does a lot more than just that. As far as sideboarding goes, let's look at just a non-elves deck for a second. Let's just look at this random affinity deck. With a deck like this one, there is usually like very clearly a worst card. So in any given matchup, like your Chalice of the Voids might be dead, and so in sideboarding you go like, these cards aren't good here, I'm going to pull out all 4. Or like, my opponent doesn't cast non-creature spells, this isn't good, I'm going to pull out all 4. But with a deck list like Elves that has an engine to it, In sideboarding, you often want to trim rather than cut. So if you cut all of your heritage druids, for example, for some reason, you lose the ability to cast a green sun and go and get one of those. So any scenario where you end up boarding out all of the copies of some card often decreases your utility very significantly. So you often don't want to go and board out everything. Sorry, you don't want to board out all copies of a single card. You instead want to trim multiple cards. So doing something like trimming like a Heritage Druid and a Birchlaw Ranger and a Quirion Ranger might give you much better results in a matchup than doing something like boarding out 3 Nettle Sentinels or something like that. So when you're doing your sideboarding, if you're just like pulling out all of the cards, all of the copies of a card because you think it's not great in that matchup, like ask yourself whether you need your Green Suns to have more utility and whether or not you need more flexibility. The final thing that I want to say here is that with Elves right now, and again, it's mid-September 2020 when I'm recording this, with Elves right now, sweepers are incredibly rare in the format. Um, Miracles used to be a more popular deck than it is, and Miracles currently is at like 1% of the metagame or something crazy like that. Again, current statistics are kind of skewed, but like traditional blue-white Miracles is much less prevalent than something like Snowco is right now. So there aren't too many copies of Terminus floating around in comparison to other metagames of the past. And cards like Pyroclasm aren't particularly popular because so many decks are playing their own creatures, with things like Baleful Strix, Icefang, Coatl, and Plague Engineer seeing a lot of play. So the decks that are running sweepers are usually the Snowco decks, and they usually have 1 to 2 copies of Dead of Winter in the 75. And this is way less than what you might be used to playing against if you've been playing Elves for a while, because you're used to dealing with like 4 Terminus plus maybe 1 or 2 Supreme Verdicts, depending on what the metagame looks like in addition to that. So there are very few true sweepers in the format right now, and some of those are even conditional at that. And what that means for you is you can often commit a lot of creatures safely to the board in a way that you couldn't in the past. And that's maybe part of what makes Elvish Reclaimer good. Like, this is an elf that needs to sit in play for a little while in order to get big and in order to do its thing. And in a world where you might face down Supreme Verdict or Terminus, realistically 3+ times in a game, that sort of elf maybe doesn't look the best. But in a world where your opponent is likely to only have 1 sweeper in a game that goes long, you can do some very different play patterns that you might not be super comfortable with if your opponent instead has access to, 6 sweepers. So many of the decks are reliant on things like Plague Engineer to answer small creature decks. And when you have some things that are living through that Plague Engineer, your opponent might not have too many ways to actually wipe the board of something like multiple Elvish Reclaimers, or an Elvish Reclaimer in Archon of Valor's Reach, or something of that nature. All right, there we go. There's a lot of word vomiting. That was about 45 minutes of me talking about elves. I hope it was useful to you. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you again to David W, for donating to make this happen. And if you're interested in funding another talk like this, I will have the information below the stream in the description. Have a great rest of the day, folks.